beforehand. And so I don't underestimate the power of what can happen locally and how that can also ripple out and ripple up, and the importance of that, and the fact that when it comes to creating change, it has to happen on those hyper levels, but then how do we band that together to be able to cause some of the larger change that we talk about, into the larger national and into the international. But I just think it's really powerful, and we have to acknowledge that power of what we see from, even us as Black Lives Matters, and how that has spread to now you see nationally and internationally people around the world sitting down to say, with the same hashtag and saying the same thing. And so how do we take that beyond just the protesting, but also be able to band together internationally and look at how we can shut those things down, right, systematically. But I just also want to say, I don't want to take away from that local and the power of it to affect.
So let me I started at the local level too. I think unless you can actually make it work. My hometown, I always think of it this way. I'm from Racine, Wisconsin, a dying industrial town in southern Wisconsin. And if I can't kind of talk to my old high school buddies about it, that it makes sense there, it doesn't make sense. So that's my starting point. However, you do, and I agree with Fred on this, you do live in a system of large-scale issue, banks, big corporations, et cetera, national scale coordination problems, as the economists call it, that the whole thing is national and international. So one of the questions that comes up, Bernie's talking about, let's break up the big banks. When they break them up, they will regroup almost instantly, as AT&T and Standard Oil did once you broke them up. So what is it we want to do about big banking institutions? What's our policy? What makes sense? My own view is you've got to make them into public banks, nationalize them. Or when General Motors goes down next time, Chrysler goes down. Why can't that become a public corporation with joint worker community national ownership? So that we begin generating ideas, starting at the local, but also dealing with the national, that begin trying to paint a picture and then assessing that picture of what might make sense in a system. So trying to get that level of dialogue going is kind of how I think about this relationship.
Yeah, and to take off from there, actually, you all have described the sort of relationship you see, or the tensions you see between the local and the national, or even the international. Taking a look at the types of change that you've worked to make locally, or the types of policies that you favor, can you describe how you imagine those affecting the national? So is it purely example setting, or is it building constituencies that can then unite with other constituencies? Is it tying everything that you do to the labor movement? What is it? How does it get bigger? Or should it not? Anyone can jump in. You look like you're ready to answer that.
Yes. First of all, I don't know that we have as many either-or kind of issues as it sounds like.
Well, I have to make it something for you to,
I'm not raising that as a criticism of the place, but just as a way to understand what it is we're struggling with and what we're trying to answer. That slavery used to exist in this country. I don't know if any of you know. By around 1850, there were close to 4 million Africans who were enslaved, mainly in the South in the United States, who had a purchase price of between $500 and say $800 a piece, which meant that represented in 1850 dollars, $3.2 billion in capital. Now, I don't know the exact size of the gross national product in 1850 in the United States, but it wasn't big enough for $3 billion not to be a whole lot of money. And it also represented more capital than anybody had. This Kentucky legislator guy named Henry Clay once said about that, he said, because he was arguing, he said, we can't just do away with all that property. We've been talking about private property, the sanctity of private property. That's what America's founded on, and how wonderful property is in private property. A lot of us didn't realize when we were in school learning about that they were talking about people's bodies that were considered property. But that was the largest capital that existed, larger than all the other industrial capital and land, was the value of these human beings. That was the property we're talking about. But anyhow, he said that some people think you shouldn't even think of these people as property. He said, but that is property which the law certainly I'm happy that there was a war and that the forces of slavery in this country were defeated militarily, and that stuff had to come to an end because there was just too much human misery that was caught up in that system of property and the incredible profits that it created that we're still talking about right now. It's a big pile of money linked to that, and we need to remember that. So I think that there's a moral, ethical case for us to be talking about every penny that we take out of the financial system, put it back into the hands of communities so that people can utilize it to meet needs. But at the same time, it has to be done on a local level, and it has to be supported by that which is national. But we cannot forget that this system is not capable of avoiding crises. It can't do it. It can't just decide we're not going to have any more crashes. We're not going to have any more bubbles burst. It can't do that because the system has built into it some contradictions that ever since it's been around, these cyclical, and they're getting worse and worse and are more and more tied into world activities in such a way that we don't have to talk about is the system that's going to change. It's going to change because it'll either collapse and head toward barbarism and chaos, or it's going to head to a more democratic system. Our effort is to figure out a way to push it toward that more democratic system that can be rooted in meeting human needs and elevating the quality of life, rather than rooted in maximizing profit and the rise of the police state that we can see out of this Black Lives Matter work. We see what this militarized police state can look like on a small scale. It can get worse. It's very capable of that. And so this is what the shift is. But much of that work will be local, and it has to have national implications as the larger and larger systemic crises that the system is part of work their way out.
So how do you think of the State of the Union? So how do we think about that mechanism of scaling up? Now I feel like I'm at a Silicon Valley convention, but how do we think about that mechanism and how we're operating on both fronts at the same time? I mean, Day, you mentioned this explicitly, but you know, it's one thing to say we'll set an example, and that's true. And actually, if we don't set examples, there's no way, even if we were to have all the power in the world, we would know what to do. But how do we think about that mechanism of sort of scaling up or getting bigger, or thinking about taking on the full forces that we're sort of grappling with here?
So part of it, what I was going to chime in on was that we look at all roads, right, that lead to it. And so, and I think it leads back to the either or, right, that this isn't an either or in terms of the method, but it's a how do we actually infiltrate, how do we utilize each and every single one of these strategies and these methods so that, I'm a prison abolitionist, and I did a lot of prison abolition work. And so obviously that's just as grappling for people to try to wrap their minds around that as it is for us to say, what do we do to get rid of capitalism, right? Because it's a huge jump from where our paradigm currently exists, everything that we know about life and how we live right now, and it makes us feel protected and safe, even if we don't like it, right? And so, people, the first thing they always ask with prison abolition, like, well, how do you get from here to there? It's mind-boggling, right? In the same way. And so I do think it's example-driven, right? That takes us to the local. And then it's also about how do we completely try to tear down what exists now, right? How do we completely try to topple it and get rid of it? Because it's anti that, how we try to infiltrate it from the inside out, and, right, which goes into the lobbying things and more the policy-driven. But how do we also just try to cut it down, get rid of it, totally dismantle it, which goes into a lot more of the disruptive work, the disruptive protesting, and just completely disrupting at every single level. And so I just say that to say, I think it's about being creative and not blocking out any of those, even if that's not the method that your organization or that you individually are partaking in, but being supportive that each one of those things can happen simultaneously, and that we look at, all right, so there's some people or there's some orgs that are going to look at how do we do this on the larger level, or how do we lobby, how do we get rid of that, how do we do policy, but that can still happen hand in hand with the small community that is trying to put together a cooperative, and how do we do better at networking the people who are doing that work so that they can all support each other, and it's no longer like this is happening here on this local level and these other big wigs are over here doing it on a policy level, and it's not disconnected.
There exists, we have to applaud. connect the local to the national and the international. I believe in protest movements and in the disruptive force they can exert, not only locally and not mainly locally, but the disruptive force they can exert on state, national, and international institutions. They can exert that disruptive force because they act locally to shut things down, to refuse, to strike, to block. And by doing that, the disorder reverberates upward on national and international institutions. You know, think in the 1930s of the automobile workers' sit-downs in Flint, Michigan. They shut down 4 plants. They occupied 4 plants. One of those plants made automobile doors, car doors. GM had 37 plants in the country that depended on the factory in Flint that made automobile doors. The shutdown in Flint spread across the country to those 37 GM plants. Or take another example. In the 1960s, welfare moms became energized, politicized by the larger black movement in large part, and they began to demand full benefits under welfare. At a time when the cities had fiscal problems, they had racial problems, and in the midst of those fiscal and racial problems, welfare budgets started to rise. That tension, that pressure, both the political pressure of the conflict and the fiscal pressure, moved upward through the federal system to state governments and to the national government. We have to use our brains, because we have brains. When we plan local protests, we should figure out how those protests will reverberate in complex horizontal and vertical systems.
The shutdowns around Black Christmas, when you saw people nationally in a coordinated effort from our official chapters shutting down the airports, right, on the largest travel day, and the fact that that slowed down travel in some places for several hours and backed up people getting on their planes, and that's where people get their money, right, and that's when people pay attention. Not at all glorifying, setting things on fire, any of those, right? But you see that when people get the attention in this country is when they actually mess with money or property. And then all of a sudden the whole nation turns and is interested. But I just want to say a good example of when we look at how the local reverberates upward, right, gets that attention, is when we look at the Black Panther Party. And so the Black Panther Party, its whole thing was meeting the needs of the people in its local communities. The Black Panther Party was not the largest threat, right, to the country. It was not because of the guns that they had, right? At the time when that statement was made from J. Edgar Hoover, there was not a Black Liberation Army that was happening. There was not large armed struggle that was happening. At the time that was made, it's because they were meeting the needs of the people. They were setting up alternatives. They were able to set up the free breakfast program that then reverberated up to now children nationally today having breakfast in their schools and being able to have free breakfast. And so that's why I say I really want to elevate the power of what can happen locally when we build strong networks, because we see, that they were able to give groceries, there were clothing, there was lead testing, there were free breakfast that was happening, and when all of that reverberated upwards, it was an alternative, right, to what people were seeing, to have to depend on the system and being able to meet their own needs, and that's what shook the government.
I think where we come from is that it's not only not an either or, but it has to be an and between protest and sort of local organizing and creation of new forms of ownership. And I think what's exciting about what's happening in New York City is that there is a growing sort of number of organizations that have that were maybe doing protest work, whether it was labor, sort of organizing and documenting workers to fight against exploitative employers, and now they're doing that, but they're also creating worker cooperatives, and also networking among other worker cooperatives so that there's some economies and things happening on that front. There's groups that are organizing homeless people and fighting against police abuse of homeless in New York, while they're also leading the fight for community land trust and mutual housing in the city. And I think that this sort of shift is really exciting. It's not just people that have the privilege to opt out of the mainstream unjust system into something that's, nicer or groovier or whatever. It's like this is actually being done by and for people that need it the most. And I think that on the flip side, right, of what we were saying before, you need that local to have the movement to support the bigger change once you have the chance to create that. So you can have a friendly person in the city council or in state office or whatever it is, but if there's not a movement that's going to fight when the powers that be try to smack down the idea, whether it's a community land trust and policies to create that, or a public bank or whatever it is, if you don't have that movement of groups and people that are going to show up and fight for it, and we've seen this in other places, that's what's going to happen. So I think you need the local in order to create the bigger change. At the same time, one could argue that you need to continue protesting to address the immediate needs of the community.
I've been sitting here thinking about some other work that I've been struggling with for the last 2 or 3 decades as a historian and political economist. What is the nature of the emerging crisis we're in, and what does that tell us about the kind of models of activism and local to top? And I want to suggest at least that it's not a classical crisis, that it may collapse because government in its oddities is strong enough to keep some kind of a floor under it, but it doesn't succeed. It doesn't collapse, but it doesn't succeed. It decays, and it's frustrating, and it doesn't solve problems. But you don't have a classical Marxist crisis. The government's twice as high as a percent of the GDP. That's a possibility, and as we are working into that strange context, it's disillusioning lots of people, and it's creating pain, and it's creating openness to consider all of what we're talking about. Why we are beginning to have thoughts about actually, for real, transforming the system, changing it, like really, rather than in abstract rhetoric, is the context is allowing us to understand more, but also driving people to take action and forcing new ideas. So I think this is maybe one of the most important periods of American history. They are running out of options. They can't solve problems. I mean, years ago, as was mentioned, I was in the government. I worked for 30 years ago for Gaylord Nelson, who founded Earth Day. I'm from Wisconsin, as I mentioned earlier. At that point, there was an alliance of liberals who could do things successfully. A lot of what happened in the 60s was a very interesting thing. That's gone. There is no capacity to solve real problems. And what that's generating is openness and activism and thinking and theory and vision. So partly what I'm encouraged by is that people are doing that and beginning to generate real thought. We talked about the piece that's in your book. How do you actually organize a system? How do you start from the bottom up? And that set of ideas, so I'm going to throw a question at the person in your seat. Taking deadly seriously the possibility, that we live in the prehistory of a truly radical transformation, taking that as seriously as you can take them, opens up all these questions, and they're very important questions. They're not abstract. They're really on right here with us now. So it comes to me as we hear what's going on, that's what we're really talking about.
Maybe you guys can address this, and I'll turn it over, but I think there's been a lot of talk about how since the 2008 crash, people have started thinking somewhat differently about Wall Street, about politics, and then we've had these upsurges. We've had Occupy, we've had Black Lives Matter, we've had several other movements like Fight for 15 and so forth. All of them very different from each other, but seemingly geared towards equality. And I'm curious whether in your work you have found changes in attitude, changes in the political possibilities that people imagine, we're here talking about next systems, has the way people thought about what the future might be changed, or a sense of possibility changed in that time?
Since 2008?
I was saying since 2008, but if there's a different delineation that makes more sense to you, by all means.
I think the biggest thing that I was going to bring up too is information and technology has been the biggest impact. I think when you're saying they're running out of options, right? And that's been the biggest change, because now, you know, we talk about things like Laquan McDonald, when we talk about the many police murders, but not just that. When we talk about people that are doing this small local work, it's traveling nationally and internationally, like at a faster rate than ever, you know. And it's funny because I was talking to somebody a few weeks ago. I was speaking at another university, and I was saying, you know, it's so funny when we look back at '94 with the Zapatistas and how we talk about how they used the internet, and how at the time everyone's like, yeah, it's the first movement that's using it, and you compare it to now, and how quickly this information moves, and how much it exposes, and how much it builds a movement around with people who are not living locally, but who are existing on this social media together, right, in this local system. And so I think that's one of the biggest changes that we've seen that has impacted people that we haven't talked about. I just think people are fed up, won't take anymore, right? Because when we talk about folks on like the impoverished Black community level, it was not a thing of like, yeah, I had all this money in the stock market and I lost it when it crashed, right? Yes, it rippled down, but we're not talking about people who followed the stock market or who had 4 or 5 different bank accounts and trusts set up and may not have all even had 401ks, right? All of these things. But it's a fed up, won't take it anymore. And when we talk about this particular community, a lot of it for us has been actually just the fight to live and to exist. So already having fought for that on a daily level, from a systematic level, now actually on a physical level of seeing people who look like us, our children, our neighbors, being killed nonstop over the last year or 2 years, and seeing it broadcast everywhere on TV and on the internet, and seeing nothing being done, right? After already seeing the levels of Katrina and the other things. And so I really attribute a lot of it to this area of work, to media, and how much it is really just out there and constantly in your face. And you can no longer just put it off and say, oh, that's that community over there, and not connect it to your life of what's going on. You know, we look at Flint, how much that has rippled out. So for me, I largely attribute that to what's been happening in media, and to the fact that it's also just been so in your face that the system has almost gotten comfortable, especially in certain places of like, oh, this is just how it is, this is how we exist. And people are like, no, that's not good anymore. We're not gonna take that anymore.
You know, yeah, it's the media, but, you know, they publicize what's happening in the country in spite of themselves. It has to explode in their face before they tell their readers what's going on. The media did not tell us about Flint very easily. The media hasn't been telling us about unemployed young people. They haven't been telling us about universities that are crippled because of the Scott Walker, for example. A lot has been happening in the country, and you know who the urgent communicator has been? The movements, the protest movements. In fact, the media pick up the story when Black Lives Matter tells them about it. The media didn't tell us about extreme inequality, the 1% and the 99%. Occupy Wall Street told us about that. The media didn't tell us about the suffering of retail workers, fast food workers, who can't get a schedule a couple of weeks in advance so they can arrange their babysitting. The movement told us about that. And Black Lives Matter has made the country aware of the tragedy, the crime of mass incarceration of Black youth in our midst. So it's the movements that are communicating and creating a kind of collective consciousness. People need that. You you go back to earlier periods, at the beginning of the Depression, a lot of people were unemployed from the very beginning, and they were ashamed of it. They tried to hide it from their neighbors. They carried lunch boxes when they walked down the street so the neighbors would think they were still going to the factory. It took the movements, the emergence of protest, which often took raucous forms that nobody approved of, like raiding the supermarket, but it was still a collective, it was a protest, and it was indignant, and that indignation brought people together and changed their understanding of what it was that was happening in the country.
I just want to clarify, when I say the media, I don't mean the big three media. I'm not talking about the MSNBCs and the CNN, or rather, I'm not only talking about them, because the generation, the young generation, especially that comes right behind me, they're not watching those things. They're watching Twitter and they're watching Facebook. And so when I say the media, I mean all forms of media, including the citizen journalists and including social media. And so the media for that generation. I'm sorry. Yes, it's right. So right, all of our independent media resources, all of our citizen journalists, that has been the largest form of media for this generation. So when I say the media is also shifting our paradigm of even what we think of when we say media, that right, that is what the movement's driven, is those forms of media.
I want to remind us though that even as things, more people reach clarity about 1% in concentration of voting power in this country, the Tea Party continues to rise and take over state legislatures across the country. Even in states that voted for Obama, who's out murdering people in Somalia and stuff. Just want to make it clear that it ain't all good. But there's this bifurcation that's taking place. Things are going in two different directions, and there's a critical importance of us doing our work, conscious of that fact, and struggling as hard as we know how to tip the scale in one direction in particular. Because other than that, you got, the rise of this Illucci running for president and giving some of the strangest press. I mean, it's a circus. It would be funny if it weren't so sad and frightening. So that's on the one hand. At the same time, the Occupy movement was the first time that capitalism lost the argument. It didn't lose power, but it lost credibility in a certain kind of way. It lost respect. And it is only on the basis of having lost respect that we can move toward it losing some of that power that again is entrenched in the laws. Like Henry Clay said, that is property, that the law says property. And we're gonna have to change some laws in terms of what it is that people can even legally own in a country. The idea that people can own the major means of production that everybody else is dependent on in order to live means that those people who own that fundamentally control the life and death of millions of people. We're talking about the economic crisis in 2008, and we got to remember that in a whole lot of those communities, the inner city, the Rust Belt, those urban communities, black folk have been in a depression since the major industries left, in the late 60s. That huge levels of unemployment that's created a generation of people living often by their own capacity to be just really, really creative and extract wealth out of all kinds of things, creating their own economies, some of which are cool, some of which are not cool at all, quite frankly. But some of them reach the point where they aren't scared of anything. And so police claim that they're afraid of them. Now, I don't believe every time a cop says he's afraid, he's actually afraid. It becomes just a really, really convenient, clever excuse for shooting and killing people. But the idea is we need to be able to intimidate these people back into their place, or who knows what will eventually happen. But again, we have to understand, I think this is connected with what Gar's talking about. This stuff doesn't happen all at once and uniformly. We might not have a clean break and a collapse that we can all recognize. January 28th, it collapsed. In some communities, it's already collapsed. In other communities, it's happening more gradually. Some new people are just coming into struggle based on the fact that these economic realities are just now reaching them. And for some of them, they're interested in turning back the clock to the good old days when Democrats were in power. Well, they don't realize that the reason the Republicans gained such an incredible amount of strength is the utter lack of imagination that the Democrats in power had in terms of dealing with the lives of people. And so people just went out and desperately said something about reparations, like, aren't you afraid that this is going to turn away some white working class people? So we can't build any kind of movement to unite people on the basis of lies. I'm just out here telling the truth about what the history of this country has been rooted in and based on. And if we can't do it this way, we're not going to do it at all. So we have to do it based in the truth. We have to struggle to organize people, many of whom are being ignored. We have to figure out who's going to go out and actually do some work, organize white working class people in this country, because there's precious too little of that being done except by the Tea Party and Donald Trump's campaign. And so if indeed that is the case, that is part of the work we're doing, but even all of that work is rooted in local communities where you have to be actually talking to your neighbors and friends and engaging people as a way of even recognizing what is wrong on the broader scale.
People want to start lining up for questions, which we'll do after we finish this part of the conversation. There are 2 mics. Go for it. And I'm going to aim to take a sort of progressive stack, as they say. So if you are non-male, a person of color, I would encourage you to come up first. If you are not, I might encourage you to defer. Organize yourselves as you will. Go for it.
Yeah, I think it's probably a good time to introduce something else that bothers me, and I think I want to put it in the middle of the table, because we haven't talked about it. I actually got involved in this question, in the system, how do you change the system out of imperialism? We haven't said a word about imperialism. We haven't said a word about the corporate role internationally. We haven't said a word about the drive of the American corporate and capitalist system to expand. And in expanding to capture markets and knock down governments, the whole mess that flows from that is part and parcel of what I think we've got to put on the table. It's got to be an international movement. And in that sense, what is the way in which we get an economic system that doesn't have to expand? How do you build that into our thinking? And I think that's got to be part and parcel of the whole discussion. The other thing I want to say is, I'm thinking that some of you all know about the populist movement in a very powerful organizing strategy, and they have what they call the lecture system. That was ways in which they kept self-educating and learning their lessons, but also trying to raise their own knowledge. And it seems to me, in some sense, I hadn't thought of this before, we're on the stage, we're on the step where we need to do that. Because there's a very rich set of questions that we've got to confront and think through and come up with answers that are understood and understood at all different levels. So imperialism, on the one hand, how do we actually put that in an expansionary system? How do we build a system that does not have to expand? And how do we actually educate ourselves as we go?
I really want to hear from people in the audience, but I do want to say just for our work, the crash of 2008, although for us it's problematic labeling the crash at that time because that's when it affected everybody, because in the communities where groups we work with live and do their work, they had been organizing and talking about predatory subprime lending for decades before that. And actually the crisis, the foreclosure crisis, was devastating and siphoning wealth out of and destabilizing communities of color in New York City and in other places, since the mid-1990s, if not longer. And there was a lot of work going on. It was sort of, wasn't in the public discourse as much, but there was incredible amounts of work. This information was brought to government regulators. It was the whole, few bad apples in this bunch. You should be grateful that anyone's making loans in these communities. The banks have redlined. Only 1 in 4 go bad. The 3 other homeowners are still in their home. Well, just to be completely clear, that one slice of the crisis led to a net loss of homeownership for people of color. So think about that and just absorb that. It's a huge crisis. So what the 2008 collapse did was just unmask, number one, that Wall Street didn't quite know what it was doing, or did actually, didn't care. That this sort of finance is something that people find very mystifying and hard to wrap their heads around. And so this notion that Wall Street banks are sophisticated and they know what they're doing and they're managing this well, or that government knows how to supervise and regulate them, all of that was sort of unmasked. The debt kind of reliance on debt that was masking income inequality, and the fact that money was being taken out of public services, colleges, and on, but being disguised because now you just indebted yourself for everything. I think that is the service that crisis did. And it's not to sort of be trite and say there's a silver lining to something that was so globally devastating, but I do think it puts us in a position where you don't have to make the case anymore. People kind of understand that something pretty different is needed.
Thank you. So I'm going to take questions two at a time, one from here and one from here. Go ahead.
Well, I'm so glad that Garza said what he did about imperialism, because one of the things I wanted to point out is that we have to put this in a much larger context. First of all, nothing's going to happen with worker collectives if we destroy the planet. And one of the biggest polluters on this planet is the U.S. military. And we need to organize with our brothers and sisters in 160 countries worldwide to shut down those hundreds of military bases that are causing that pollution, that are causing that imperialism. That would put trillions of dollars back into our hands to do things like public infrastructure repair, health care, and public education. But the other thing is that slavery never ended. It's called the prison industrial complex, and what worker collectives can possibly compete with slaves? It's been reported that some private licensed construction contractors in Colorado have been bankrupted. These people were paying living wages, but they can't compete against the prison gangs building houses out there. We've got to shut that down, and that raises a larger issue of not just prison reform, but reform of the so-called justice system. We don't have a justice system, we have a judicial system, and we the people have to start advocating to not only disbar, but lock up these corrupt prosecutors that are withholding exculpatory evidence and suborning perjury on the stand. I've seen it. I've seen prosecutors getting cops to lie. We've got to speak out about that. And the larger issues of racism even on the civil side, when Erin Andrews can get a $55 million verdict because somebody filmed her in her underwear through a peephole in a hotel, while Laquan's family and Freddie's Gray's family gets nothing. So I just
Okay. A brief comment and then a
Brief comment.
question. Brief comment is I noticed in the beginning when Gar made the distinction as well, we don't want state socialism and we don't want capitalism, but there's been no reference to the long history of the alternate tradition of revolutionary anarchism. In fact, at this conference, I noticed there's only one workshop, and that's in its title. That's my comment. My question is, I noticed that most people here are in favor of building alternate institutions, cooperatives and worker-owned enterprises and local organizations and credit unions and so forth. My question is what the strategy is about these. Now, the liberal strategy would say, well, we'll build these things and make capitalism a better society on the margins. Nobody here seems to be advocating that. But then there are two other possibilities. One is we see these as models in which these people can give the idea, they can see in reality how it's possible for alternate ways of people organizing and running their lives. The other possibility is people think, no, they see this as the strategy, that gradually these alternate institutions will grow and grow, sort of like kudzu, and take over capitalism, and somehow take over General Motors and the Bank of America and so forth and so on. Now, I think the second is very unlikely to work. I think the first is what I would advocate, but it's not clear to me from what people said how you see it.
Thank you. Okay, so we have a question about the intersection of the prison industrial complex and the justice system with economic justice, as well as the military industrial complex, and we have a question about a sort of kudzu versus a sort of different angle on overthrowing capitalism.
You know, the 13th Amendment made it very clear that they were only ending slavery outside of prisons. That means that it very much continues to exist inside, but you're absolutely correct. You're also absolutely correct. And, you know, matter was a brief comment on Obama's folk having bombed and killed 150 people. I don't even know if people know about that. Everybody know about the drone attacks in Somalia a couple of days ago? You know, 150 people dead. We don't know who they were, what they were doing, and far too few people even care. And so we live in a situation where the President of the United States and the military tell us almost anything about something they've done, and folks say, well, they must know what they're doing, it's okay. And that is so sick, because we cannot respect the humanity. If 150 people at some graduation in the United States got killed by the Russian army on the basis of they were getting ready to possibly organize to attack the Russian army later in some base that the Russians had set up in Colorado, that, people would be like, well, that's crazy, they can't do that to us. But somehow, this treating of other people in the world as though they are purely instrumental to the increase in profit and the power of actually just an elite inside this country, not the whole country, not all white people. But it is one of the sicknesses that we have to overcome and expose and talk about a whole lot. And in answer to your question, it's really clear to me that kudzu is not about to overthrow capitalism, nor will tiny worker cooperatives or community-run businesses or anything, that unless there is some major collapse out of which people are looking to new models. And that's what I had tried to say when I was talking, that there's a huge crisis, that there are various levels of it. It's reaching the level of intensity where it doesn't have the kinds of ways to buy its way out of it that it's utilized before, that people will increasingly be looking for alternatives. We have to create something so that we shift the motion of that more and more weighted toward the democratic, the local, meeting people's needs rather than generating profit, the increase in use values rather than exchange value, that all these kinds of things has to be a shift in people's thinking that grows out of some of the work that we're doing.
Yeah, just everything that both of you just said, that you said and you said about the justice system. I think not just about that, but even when you have people out here who are not being held accountable for their actions due to this new affluenza, around the fact that you were raised with all of this affluent lifestyle that you just cannot tell the difference between right and wrong. And then on the flip side of things, when we look at the number of Black and Hispanic Latino people who are imprisoned, right? That says a lot about what this country will do and what the justice system and all these other institutions do to uphold and to protect the wealthy and those whose lives they believe to matter. And I think that's essentially the core of what you're both saying, even about the military, right? There is this hierarchy of whose lives matter, right? And that's what is at the core of this conversation, is how do we get rid of that? Because that takes us back to the property, because it takes us back to the fact that you are still 3/5 or less than 3/5 of a human being in my eyes and how I see you as a human, right? And then there's this whole other hierarchy of how everyone else internationally and globally also falls within that system. And we see it every time we see something happen internationally and it does not hit the news, right? When it happens in certain countries, like we were talking about Somalia, or the outcry that we hear around it when it does hit the news, or how long it's talked about in the news, versus when it happens to other people in other countries and the countries that people care about. When we see the attacks that happened in Paris, and then, right afterwards we saw everyone saying, okay, what about what's going on in Africa, and how we see those when we juxtapose them. I think the alternative is, whenever this does collapse, right, hopefully it comes sooner than later, when it does happen, we need to have these alternatives in place, because we need to make sure that there's something else to defer to, and then we usher that right on in and we say, okay, here are these other systems. We need to make sure that we keep spreading the alternatives so that people keep getting more accustomed to them. They're no longer these foreign concepts that we're just talking about in a conceptual level, but that there is an actual tangible thing that people can say, okay, here this is, it's working. And then we can begin to break down just the talk around it, the large words, and they're able to walk up and see how that actually functions in their lives day to day, so that can come in. Because when we talk about 2008, when we talk about the crash and what happened, people losing their homes, we talk about those things happening in different cities. We see gentrification happen right afterwards, because there's people who are ready to come in to take advantage of the situation and to be able to rebuild, right, and reconstruct these neighborhoods, because there are not alternatives set up for people who are informed.
I really agree exactly with that. I want to say one word about the nature of the models are. Probably 2 words. This is a country with very little current socialist tradition. So introducing the simple idea that democratic ownership, the fundamental principle, is possible in everyday life is a really important thing to do. That it's not crazy, it's not off in wild land. And worker co-ops is one piece of that. And municipal ownership so you begin to see examples that you can draw on. Now, they're all compromised, but nonetheless, they give you something to hold on to that begins to offer you some sort of generalized possibility. I think the possibility of a very different kind of transformation is possible, likely. In fact, it's partly developing consciousness, partly developing movement. I don't think it may depend on a crisis collapse in the classical form. In building knowledge and movements in a very kind of unusual form. And I think we get stuck in the old ideas of what the crisis is about. I can put that another way. I'm with Karl Marx in his last speech that the U.S., Britain, and maybe the Netherlands might have an evolutionary reconstruction rather than a collapse. But I think we have to get out of the categories and think differently about possible transformative possibility. And one last thing. It really is possible, I think, and this is hard, but I think it's really hard to really actually think that we are living in the prehistory of a fundamental revolutionary period. Really. And if you really grasp that as a possibility, not an inevitability, it really sharpens the focus of what the hell really matters and how we get to work. So, I mean, I really like the conversation and the depth of it.
And I do want to add to that. I think there's something we've seen in countries that are actually in crisis, and I think it's notable that I think most people, maybe not all, but have suggested that what we are doing is planning for how we're going to be at or after the moment of crisis. Not that we ourselves are going to create the crisis, but that may be beyond us right now. But that rather it's a larger force that will collapse and we'll have to do something in the vacuum. And I wanted to mention that one place where a seemingly somewhat healthy economy collapsed was Greece. And one of the things you saw emerge was sort of worker co-ops, and a lot of the types of things you're talking about rising up and essentially holding the fabric of society together, whether it was medical care or groceries or child care, education, because there's no public money left. And what was remarkable was a lot of the people at the core of that were people who had been, among other things, anti-globalization activists, and had spent a lot of time thinking about how you make good co-ops. And suddenly this knowledge, which seemed very esoteric, and they were not politically relevant people, was very much in demand, and they were shocked. And it's funny to talk to them. They're like, yeah, we were weirdos, and here we are running Greek society. And now, like, I don't want to sugarcoat it. This is not going well in Greece. You need public money. But a vacuum was created, and the people who had been figuring it out became incredibly valuable. And I think that that is actually a circumstance in which we can see this playing out to some degree. So I want to move. Does anyone else want to get in on that question before I move on?
I just wanted to address the anarchism piece too, because I know we didn't really address that that she brought up. And I come from some of the background around people of color anarchists. I just also want to raise, sometimes it's moving away from the terminology and what the essence of things are. So when we look at this movement right now, a lot of times I take it to people always saying, well, where is this leader, right? Which we heard in Occupy, and it's also now the question of the day, right? To the larger movement that's going on now. And I think that actually is very anarchist, and the fact that it has been switching the paradigm, and no matter who asks, people are like, no, I'm not giving in. This is a leader-full movement, right? And I think that actually is a really powerful, uplifting, right? A lot of the principles around anarchism. And so sometimes people don't have to use the language and their terminology, and we don't have to get caught up in that, but we see how it plays out. And sometimes even using the terminology can be off-putting, right, to some people who don't get that. And so even when we talk about socialism, I think about one of my favorite scenes quickly in Murder at Hampton was where they're talking to the lady from the west side of Chicago about, is the free breakfast program a socialist program? And she said, look, I don't know what socialism is, but I know this. If you take the free breakfast program away from my babies, I'm gonna F you up, She was like, I don't know what the socialism thing is, right? And so people don't always know those words and those terms, but when we give those tangible things, they can identify with that, right? We don't always have to put the other words on them. And so people may not be saying anarchism right now, but it's a lot of the things that are happening when we talk about people building. We have a whole movement out here right now that's completely against the hierarchical structure. And it's completely about how do we coexist? How do we lift up the margins amongst the marginalized? So I think that there actually is a lot of that that's happening right now, even though it's not being contextualized with those words and terms.
Thanks, Son. Yeah, you're good. I kind of feel so privileged to step into for what I thought was a question, and in many ways you've already answered it. But let me frame it. So thank you, each one of you, for already answering part of what I want to frame. I love the idea to think that we are at a prehistoric moment. I'm a science fiction buff too, so I can work with that, and I can work with hundreds of years. And at a very young age, I understood that decisions from our native people should be made by 7 generations. So I like thinking 7 generations forward and back. And I think that capitalism and our system as it stands now is not going to be here forever. So the prophecies of native people on this globe are saying we're in a time. This is a time that's been prophesized. So I want to say something that may not otherwise be spoken at this conference, but we can dare to say it. That we're at a spiritual awakening time. And when I spend time on Facebook and see how much people talk about love, I'm like, yeah, something's going on here. And some of them are traditionally religious, but others are grabbing it. So when I was at Occupy Wall Street, my favorite sign, that was on my Facebook page for a while, was compassion is our new currency. So I want to really put this out as a common value, because I can spend my whole life, and all of us can do that, things we're fighting for and things we want to build. But what makes it a movement in common might be a common currency or a common value. I'm going to just be repeating things you've each said. A consciousness that lets us say we're all in this together. Because the consciousness of capitalism, which is older than 2008 or 1929 or the beginning and end of slavery. You know, people say this era astrologically and in terms of these prophecies go by like a 2,000-year era. We can even go further back. Competition, dare I say, is it really required for life on the planet? No. Because nature says no. Nature says there's life and death, but there is coexistence. And so I wonder if we can really look as a thread through everything. Because what everybody's saying is right, and there's so much work to be done. To think about compassion as one of those elements that we bring up, to think about love. So when I think about developing co-ops, and I've been in many groups, I've had different experiences. Competition and hierarchy and fighting comes up, and so the whole notion of conflict resolution, like that's revolutionary. That's revolution. We can learn how to talk and respect each other. So this really talks about marginalization in each little room, in each heart, and ultimately sort of saying the brilliance of the caring people who were our mothers all were. We all around caring people, and it wasn't valued. It's a very important value to bring up, like you referenced in Greece, of like people know how to do this, how do we bring it up. So I just want to ask people to think about that and share more of how you think it will come forward. Thank you.
But when I came, you guys started talking about inequality and the need for next systems, and you brought up Noam Chomsky and Bill McKibben, and they were talking about the fact that the current system doesn't work. So one of the things that I'm quite interested in finding out from you guys is, yes, you started off talking about inequalities and so on and so forth, but if you look in the last 10 years, since the financial crisis, by and large, not just here, but just about in every part of the world, it's been a jobless growth. Okay, I originally come from India. India 30, 40 years ago used to have food shortages. But today there is no food shortage. But a lot of people are hungry because there is a difference in terms of who has the monies and who doesn't. And it's not that inconceivable that this is going to happen here within the next 10, 15 years, because one of the things that's not talked about, I have a technology background, is the incoming of automation and robotics and the amount of jobs that will disappear. Not that it is the ill intention of these people who are creating these automated or robotic firms. It's become kind of the nature of things to the extent that in certain parts of the world, like in Britain, some of the leading economists are talking about this phenomenon may be difficult to stop, but maybe what we need to look at is something like the concept of a living wage. This concept of a minimum wage doesn't make sense because often minimum wage doesn't cover food, clothing, and shelter. So it's a little bit of a radical idea, but it's starting to come. So I would like to ask you guys to think about it in terms of, if you're talking about the next systems, if you're talking about a future where there is more even distribution, how are you going to make sure that there is jobs, whether, like you talked about, should it be not based on welfare, but that's where I brought in the concept of living wage, whether you have a job or not. How do you ensure there's minimum food formation?
Great, thanks so much. Okay, let's take those two. So we have this sort of question of compassion, and I think also just how workable these systems are that people have told us run against human nature. What runs with human nature is having a boss because people are bad. And is there something to be discussed on this front in your experience? Is there something political here? And second, if the robots are stealing our jobs, how do we have money? So who'd like to take this off?
Let me, be apostate here. And I worked in factory automation for 30 years. I worked in a factory 30 years. Last 11 of them I was in helping to build and troubleshoot automated systems across the factory floor. And I visited very recently in Canton, Mississippi, the Nissan plant there. It's capitalized at something like $36 billion or something worth of industrial robots that are very rapidly building a Nissan car. Also had 2,000 people working in it. Robots have the capacity to reduce the amount of human labor that goes, or living labor that goes into production of commodities by virtue of using a lot of dead labor. There's a capitalization cost of the robotic equipment, et cetera, that goes into it. But still, labor is that which produces value in the world, and that's not about to change. And there's nothing that any number of robots will ever do that will fundamentally change that fact. So the relationship that we have to struggle with is how do we make sure that the living labor, which produces value, and the dead labor that it utilizes in order to produce value is put to service rather than to increase profits and the accumulation on the part of a few people, how to put to service to meet human needs and elevate the quality of life. That's regardless of the number of machines that get used in the process. So there might be a situation where we need to reduce the working day to a shorter working day. I'm incredibly uncomfortable with the idea of simply having a guaranteed wage, because my question is, well, who is it that then owns and organizes production from which the values that end up being distributed with this wage guarantee, are coming from? Because unless the owners and the organizers of production are the people themselves, or the community writ large, then the concentration of the power to either produce or not, to control the means and the nature of distribution, the portion of it that you want to distribute as opposed to the portion of it that you want to hoard or not, is something that's still in the wrong hands. So I'm not at all comfortable with that, and I think that by and large it's a scheme on how to save capitalism. And I'm not interested in figuring out how to save capitalism. It should die. And it should die out of a transformation that creates a democratic structure where people are in control both of production and consumption, not just something that simplifies the construction thing, and a structure that values care work, and if need be monetizes care work, but at the very least values care work in such a way that it is compensated and as dignified as any of the other things that we do as part of building and developing community. I think that the kind of shortcut scheme around kind of connecting to, well, you got really robots, and pretty soon robots are going to be making robots. I don't even want to live in that world. I've seen Terminator. I'm living in a world where robots build robots. First of all, it's very, very far off in terms of science fiction. And I know that because I was involved in industrial electronics for years, and I know kind of some sense of what robots are capable of doing. And the idea of having a robot that can design and build another robot is a frightening reality that we ought to make sure never happens. But it's just like nuclear power. That on the one hand, they can teach you in school how to build a nuclear bomb. What they do less well is teach you whether or not you should build a nuclear bomb. And we have choices to be made in the kind of economy that is made. We can't assume that these are just simply runaway processes in which human judgment, human values no longer take any kind of role in determining how we organize and construct a production process in the world that allows us to produce that which we need to meet our needs and elevate the quality of life. And I think that's what we need to be doing and figuring out how to do that on a democratic basis, as opposed to looking at one component of it, which is the question of income and guaranteeing that in such a kind of way, and somehow leaving all these other huge questions about who organizes and decides all of the stuff as it relates to the production in the society, the quality of it, the nature of it, how it relates with the natural environment, all of this stuff. I mean, who's going to be deciding all that when we put everybody on welfare? I'm not down with that program, and I think that we are capable of building a democratically organized thing on the basis of democratic ownership, democratic setting of values that owns the entire economy, and again locks it back into this question of meeting needs and elevating the quality of life.
And Francis, I want to get you in here. That's directly on that.
I would not say that giving people income supports was a magic bullet toward the reorganization of society. I just said that it would be a better way to support people and support poor people especially. I don't worship wage work. Often wage work is glorified. This is an old Marxist idea as the right to power. It didn't really happen that way, did it? It's time we recognize that. We have to figure out other routes to power. A guaranteed income is not a route to power. It's a way to make people more secure, and that's a step toward power. Security is a step toward power. It is not nirvana. There are many problems to be solved in our society, and I certainly never meant to say that a basic income will solve them all.
I want to accuse you haven't said any of it.
That's good.
I want to toss a couple, I've been worried about this topic. So, a couple of numbers. Currently, if you broke up the income of the United States equally, every single family of four would have over $200,000. It's a very rich system. Very rich system. In New York,
A year?
yes, all a year. $200,000 a year for every family, every four people. That's the GDP divided up equally. In the 20th century, technology without the robots increased 7-fold over 100 years. If it goes that way without the robots, and there's a big fight going on about Robert Gordon's got a book, whether the robots are doing it, there's a big fight about all this. You're way up in $1 million and $2 million per family of four. Whether the planet can handle that's one question, but the obvious answer if you're looking for an egalitarian solution is to radically reduce the work week. You could do it today, $100,000 for every family of four if we had egalitarian spend a 20-hour week for everybody. So those are the questions that are implicit in both this technological robot question and how you allocate the production and resources.
I think just one small point. But I was talking about, I was mentioning robots and automation. The fact of the matter is, it's not just moving men we are talking about, like little robots. It's the aspect of automation that is really taking up jobs. That the question is, if you add it to the inequality, creates the imbalance, and how do you solve it? That's why you need to have some kind of a balance.
I think this is partly what people are talking about in referring to shorter work weeks. The idea that there could be a reduction in total labor, but distributed more evenly, if I'm understanding that.
And I think both of what you said connects to what you said earlier around, and I'll say that because we're talking about too, partly is compassion, humanity, right? Realizing that people actually matter, and you don't have to, even in New York, we look at taking people out of the stations, right? So there's no longer, in a lot of the train stations, there's no longer an MTA physical person that's there, right? But that having actual people in places and available, right? That goes around looking at the humanity of it. And I think the only way we can even talk about moving to a livable wage is to actually talk about what you said earlier, Dara. We have to get away from the idea of expanding, because as long as we look at the idea of expansion, we're talking about the idea of greed. And as long as we look at the idea of greed, when you talk about livable wage, it doesn't only mean being able to make as much as you need to survive. It also means being able to limit yourself, right, to what you need to be able to live and survive, and not all the other expansive things that come beyond that. So that's a whole other paradigm shift. It also means that we have to look at what the cost of things are in the market right now. How come it costs so much, right, to be able to afford the food that is healthy, that allows you to actually be able to live, right, a healthy lifestyle? How much the price of gas, all these other things are that we need to be able to exist. And so, because that large, right, influences what the livable wage even would be, so that we not only look at wage, but we also look at the cost of the things that are in the market and how we're able to change that. And on the topic of compassion, and compassion is very important to me, because I do think that love and understanding, right, that's how we actually get to be able to meet each other as individuals and to be able to actually understand. But I think before compassion, we have to talk humanity, because you can be a compassionate person, but if you don't see my humanity the same as your humanity, then your compassion for me will not be the same as the compassion that some people have for animals, or the compassion that some people have for the environment, but don't have for certain lives in this world, or don't have for certain people in this world. So I think we have to first talk about actual humanity before we can talk about compassion.
Okay, I'm gonna take a last two and ask them with efficiency, because the hour is late. One there, one here.
Okay, a few people talked about the lack of imagination among the Democrats, etc. I've always said one thing: if you want to coerce our elected officials into following the industrial plan and not deviating, all you have to do is lower the stock market by 5,000 points, and the entire country will be thrown into such panic. There's no more complicated scheme needed than that. There's no back room. All you need to do is that, and the whole country will be willing to go with whoever can restore order. So you have to bear that in mind. Okay, now with that said, there's one new factor that is creating the possible anger that could displace the system. Now, Donald Trump, who I find repulsive, is scaring the Republicans because he's opposing free trade, and he's opposing things that they have always upheld, and upholding things they've always opposed. He opposes pro-choice. He said we need to give health care to people. He's also said some horrible things that are racist, of course, obviously. But he's tapping into the working class dissatisfaction with what the Republicans have brought. That's creating the opportunity that everyone here in this room has now, and it's coming from a right-wing revolutionary. He's not even that right-wing, but he is a racist, but he's not right-wing. He's a populist. Therefore, my question to all of you is, this is how the revolution may happen, folks. It's not going to happen because a Democrat got up there and did something brave, because that all the multinationals will do is laugh and jiggle the stock market. It's going to be because a right-winger, and it's happening right now, is breaking the established order that the Republicans have relied on to keep all their masses in shape. And what do we do now? Because this is the opportunity we waited for, nothing else, and we have to be ready to take the revolution no matter how unappetizing it may be to all of us. That's my question.
I have so many questions, but I'm going to keep it brief. Maybe one question. All you guys up here, do you have an existing model? Do you know any existing model that can replace or reform our economic model?
Asking a big question. Okay, let's do this. We're solving capitalism. Go.
Return both nature and the product of human labor on nature, which is finance, to the commons, so that we again have a pool from which people are able to go make use of productive assets in order to meet their needs and elevate the quality of life. The particular forms that will take will be many, because the world we live in is a complex world in which there are a whole lot of different things that people want produced. But the salient feature of it right now is that nature itself and the accumulated product of human labor on nature over millennia is concentrated in the hands of a handful of people who use that ownership as a means of concentrating even more such ownership in the future. That should be illegal, people engaged in that ought to be
Agree with you.
locked up or just totally can't do it, first of all, and you might not even have to lock anybody up, that'd be nice. But at the very least, the creating of a new commons that includes both nature and the financial output, which is again labor operating on nature that has been accumulated. We're talking about 83, maybe close to $100 trillion in the world right now that ought to be in a commons that is democratically allocated in order to meet people's needs and elevate the quality of life. And the particular forms of that may vary. And in fact, indeed, in a complex world where people have different ideas, outlooks, histories, inclination, like it will vary. But that has to be an essential feature of it if it is to ever be a just and sustainable world.
And Dave, thinking about the commons example, is you are creating commons. You are working on creating commons in the sense, no, but community land trusts, co-ops.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've just really been enjoying listening to everybody. This is such a great conversation. I think that, one thing that we can take part in is that these, we're talking about a new system and X system, but so many of these models, again, they're out there and they've existed for a long time. Some of them need to be re-radicalized because maybe they were sort of complacent and forgot that they were cooperatives or things like that. But there's also new variations on it. I think some of the work that Ed is doing with groups like the Working World here in New York and other kinds of loan funds around the country that are really, it's incredible what they're doing, sort of developing models of finance that are not extractive. That's our entire financial system has just figured out so many ways to extract from people, from neighborhoods, from our economy. Finance is supposed to be pretty boring, and it's supposed to serve, it's supposed to serve a real economy that's bringing public sort of benefits, and it's become this thing that extracts and controls our economy. And so I think, I just think there's so many inspiring things that are models and examples out there that can be scaled up to work that people should get involved with. In terms of our work, we have a nascent public bank campaign as well in New York that we're really excited about, and I hope if anyone's interested in that or community land trust work, we'll at our session tomorrow. But we also, with the community land trust work, I think what's really exciting about that is that we are sort of thinking about this in a very different way, specifically looking at creating these commons in neighborhoods right now that are the hardest hit by gentrification. This is work that's being led by the lowest income New Yorkers who have the most at stake, who are going to be displaced if something radical doesn't change in New York City. And so, it's very much part of what we're trying to do through all of our different strategies is foster this kind of work so that there is this sense of, sort of control and shaping by people who really need it, that we can envision and actually start putting into practice these different models that have proven to work sometimes even more efficiently than some of the private kind of market models.
I have on behalf of my friend Harry, sorry. What do you think of the idea of money? Do we really need it at this time?
Thank you. We're trying to get another giant question into the light.
Yes.
Hold on. Let's carry through, and then I suspect people can also come up and talk afterwards. We're not going to just disappear in a puff of smoke as well.
I wanted to make a comment. May I say
Yes.
that? I think that there is a place in a vigorous and diverse left for discussions of solutions, of models, of next systems. There's a place even for trying to construct those models. But it isn't quite true that we don't have any solutions. It isn't true that we don't know how to make things better. We may not know how to make them perfect. We don't know how to make them perfect. But we know that we should stop incarcerating so many people. We know that we need a police that is tamed. We know that we need higher wages for low-wage working people. We know that we need a decent housing policy. We need affordable housing. Look at a city like New York that is actually expelling its working classes of all colors. We know all those things. We know that we need child care. Can you imagine? We sent millions of women, we cut them off the welfare, we send them to work, and we didn't have a child care system? Flint's water is a crime, but so is that a crime. There are a lot of things that are wrong that we know are wrong. We know how to fix them, but we don't have the power to implement our solutions. So a left has to think not only about next systems, not about models for how problems can be solved, but how to build its power. And you know, a lot of Americans agree broadly with Bernie Sanders, for example. I'm sorry, I'm poking you in the face. Americans have positions on policies that are altogether different from the policies that are being implemented. We have to help to empower those people and to give force to their views. I don't happen myself to have much confidence in the idea of total cataclysm, total revolution, whatever. In fact, I look back on history and I don't see a lot of successful revolutions. I think we have to work to build power, to transform society, and to do it through crisis after crisis after crisis. It's not going to be one big step. Our problem is power. Let's talk about systems, that's okay, but we have a bigger problem with power.
I just think they're all related, right? As I'm listening, like, because essentially capitalism sits on this need for power, right? It sits on this need for control because you have to have the people up here, you have to have the masses down here in terms of the hierarchy and how things flow up and don't flow down. And so it's all about power and control, right? And even when we talk about do we need money, that's such a wide question because it's like in what context do we need money to actually support the current global economical system that exists? Do we need money just to exist? We know we don't need money just to exist because we see people exist every day who have no money or little to no money. So it's like, are we talking about on a systematic level, or can we actually build a world where we don't need money? That's all possible, right? But it's like, how creative do we want to get and think out of the box? And where do we want to talk about actually paradigm shifting people? And the first thing for me in that is us not looking at these other things as an alternative to capitalism, or an alternative for the prison industrial complex, or an alternative to Western healthcare, but for us to look at those things as alternatives because they are alternatives to humanity. They're alternatives to freedom, to justice, to all the things that we want, right? So that's the first step, is to stop looking at everything else as an alternative to these things and to start looking at it as like capitalism is an alternative to what we should actually have, and to actually flip these things.
So just a quick response to the two questions and a follow-up. I can't follow that, it's too good. I think you guys said something about Trump. It's possible that Trump will split it's possible Trump will split the Republican Party badly enough so that there'll be a big wave of Democrats elected. Possible. Possible. And Bernie's possible. Whatever happens to Bernie is going to be a movement building thing. Injecting more and more radical ideas into that process may be a big opening. I mean, we just have to really begin to think about that. The other question about models and so forth, a couple websites. The website is community-wealth.org. Put the dash in. It's a compendium of various other websites of what people at land trust, worker co-ops, what's going on around the country, public banks, all these kinds of things. That website is a pretty good source for many other websites as well, if you want to get into it. And on system models, the next system is the website. There's lots of, we're trying to encourage a debate about really what the hell do you want? What's the system look like? And then, there will be some 26 different, including a couple of anarchist visions, but worked out. So you can grapple with it and struggle with it. This is stupid, that's smart, why don't we pick from here? thenextsystem.org, you'll find what we've been trying to accumulate and start an intelligent discussion of where all this goes.
I want to thank all of our panelists who have spent some years building next systems and helping us to imagine and think more intelligently about what those might be. And I'd like to thank the conference organizers for being spectacular. It's been great to be here with all of you. Thank you so much. And people are welcome to stick around and chat. There will be a reception across the courtyard. Across that courtyard? Yes, there will be a reception across the courtyard after this, and everyone can join that. That's actually a better place to chat than standing around the stage. I believe there's food and drink. Oh, there's wine, yeah, go crazy.